A friend of mine gave me a piece of wormy maple, and I used it to make this box. I decided that I wanted to put a ribbon finial on the top that I'd seen somewhere on the internet. I wasn't sure how to do it, but I thought about it for a while and figured it out. When I showed the finished product to some other friends, they said, "How'd you make that ribbon finial?" Thought about that for a while and decided maybe I should make a video so I can show everybody how I did it. The process of making the ribbon finial is fairly straightforward, and my first attempt took me less than an hour. I began by selecting a 1-inch stock. I used maple. I then drilled a 1/2-inch hole down the middle of the stock, about the length that I wanted to create a ribbon. I then turned the sides parallel to about 3/4 of an inch. This left me about a 1/16 of an inch ribbon. I then turned it a little bit smaller as I smoothed it and sanded it, and I sanded up to 400 grit. I then went on to plug the hole. I felt I needed to do this before I made the cuts to reinforce the sides. I started by drilling the 1/2-inch hole, as you can see here. Nothing too different from a normal drilling operation on the lathe. I drilled about 3 inches down. I thought that would give me a nice length for my ribbon spiral. The next step was to round the finial. I started by measuring the depth of my drilled hole and marking it on the wood so that I would make sure that I did not start to make the finial too skinny before I got to the bottom of the hole. Once I had it marked, I brought up the tailstock and started to turn the finial down, the wood down to get the final shape of the finial. Here you can see I'm using a roughing gouge, which I use for most of the turning at about 1200 RPM. As I get close to the finished size, I use calipers set to 3/4 of an inch to see how I'm progressing. Then I continue with the roughing gouge, trying to get it down to 3/4 of an inch. Go slowly at this point, as you want to be semi-careful about how big your finial is becoming. As you can see, I'm now down to 3/4 of an inch at the end, and so I'll go back at this point and get the rest of the finial down to 3/4. Use a parting tool to mark the end of the finial so that I know how far I need to go back and keep it 3/4 of an inch. Remember, I don't want to get it too skinny where I have the hole drilled, otherwise I'll break through to the hole. Once I have enough of the finial down to 3/4 of an inch, I start to use the skew to get a nice clean surface. My objective here is to take the finial down a little bit thinner than 3/4. I said earlier that the wall thickness would be a 1/16 at this point. Actually, it's an 1/8 at this point, and I'm really shooting to get down closer to maybe 3/32 of an inch. After sanding, at the end of the process, you'll probably get down to the finished thickness, which is closer to a 1/16 of an inch. Parting tool helps to get a little bit of the meat out of the way so that I can get my final 3/4 of an inch diameter. Now that I have the basic part of the finial down to the right size, I can start to work on the end of the finial and where it will meet the top of my product. Another measurement, make sure I'm on track and I know where the end of my hole is. Check for tear out. Clean up the last of the finial and get my nice parallel sides. Another quick measurement and a mark so I know where I'm going to put the round over at the bottom of my finial. And then using the dreaded skew to make a bead. Here's a spindle gouge that I use to get a little of the meat out of the way. And now back to the skew to get that bead just right. Hopefully I don't get any catches. Get a little more of the excess out of the way with the roughing gouge. And now turn the bead at the bottom of the finial. This is the bead that will meet up with the top of whatever the finial goes on. My design here is fairly simple. A bead at the bottom of the ribbon and another bead at the matching that at the top of the product. Oh, a little bit of a catch, nothing major. Okay, made it through 2 half beads without any major problems. Now I can set the bottom of the finial. I'm going to aim for about a 3/8 tenon here. That will give me enough to stick into the hole on top of my project. I'll undercut the bead at the bottom, make sure that I get a good tight fit. Here's the undercutting process using the parting tool. Another set of calipers set to 3/8. And we're done. Now it's time to move on and do a little sanding. I like to start with a sanding block so that I can get the sides good and parallel, and then I'll move on to using sandpaper and move up through 400 grit. Once I've sanded through 400 grit, it's time to part off the finial. I take it most of the way down using the parting tool, and I like to back off the center because I don't like to have it under pressure when I part it off. There we go, parted off and completed. Okay, so I said I was going to plug the hole and then mark the spiral. But actually, I'm going to mark the spiral and then plug the hole. Like I said, I use tape to mark my ribbon. Very easy. I use 3/4 inch wide tape. You can use 1/2 inch wide tape. You can use 1 inch wide tape. It's whatever width you want that ribbon to be. That's your choice. How tight you wrap it, that's also your choice. The tighter, the harder it's going to be to work with. Make it too wide and it's just a straight line. So somewhere in between is about right. Trim the tape up. Get it out of my way so it won't be flapping around when I'm working with it. Then I'm going to go back and, again, knowing what the depth of my hole is, going to mark where the bottom is. And this is important because when you cut the spiral, you get down to the bottom of where you're cutting, you have to work your way out the side of the cut so that you can remove the waste. You'll see that when we get to the cutting portion. So what you see here, the tape will be the ribbon that's left. The wooded part will be the part that is cut away. Now typically I try to make the ribbon a little shorter than the depth of the hole. That way I have a little bit at the bottom where if I want to put a center finial in like you saw in the one that I showed, it's available to hold the bottom of that finial as it goes inside the ribbon finial. So I'm marking about 1/4 inch above the bottom of the hole. So now I'm going to use a pencil just to darken the edge of the line that I'm going to cut on the scroll saw. Fortunately, I'm having a little problem with focus here. But I think you'll get the idea. I'm just darkening along the edge of the tape, double checking my measurement for the bottom. And marking where I'm coming out with the saw blade. The spiral is already marked, so now we have to fill the hole, make a sled, cut a kerf in the sled, cut the spiral, and then finally you will have to sand the ribbon to your desired shape. Use a 1/2 inch dowel to plug the hole, then trim it even with the end. The next step is to glue the dowel in place. I use the very thick or gel super glue so it won't run down inside. I want the dowel to be easy to remove once I'm done cutting. Spread it all around a little to kind of even out the end. And then use accelerator to dry the glue. Next, I use some triangular scraps that I have left over from making some miter cuts to make a V-block to hold the finial while I cut it. Now I make the V-blocks just slightly shorter than the total length, mostly because the bead on the bottom is slightly larger than the finial, and I want to make sure that it hangs over the end and doesn't tip the finial. I want the finial to sit flat in the V-block. So I use these two triangular pieces, cut to about the same length. That will give me a nice V-block. And so you can see here how the piece sits in the V-block. And it'll allow it to rotate when I go to cut it, because I have to rotate it when I'm cutting it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. The next step is to put a piece across the bottom to hold the two triangular pieces together to complete the V-block. Again, this lifts the finial up slightly off the bed of the saw and allows the base of the finial plenty of clearance room so it doesn't tip the finial when it's in the V-blocks. And there's the shapes all put together to make the sled. Now that I have all the parts, I simply use two-sided tape to hold everything together. Once you got the tape on, you can put the V-box in place, or the triangles in place to form the V-block. Second one goes on to finish the V. Now we have a completed sled. The piece sits in there and it will allow it to rotate. Mark the point where the tape edges are and draw a line connecting those 2 points. This gives you the entry point for the blade that will cut off the edges of the ribbon. The next step in the process is to put a kerf down the center of the sled. Now it's not actually down the center, it's a little offset because the ribbon's not exactly centered, and that's what you really want. You don't want a ribbon that goes halfway around. And if you did, you could make it that way. So I used the saw to cut a kerf that's just off the center. I started it by marking it using the line that was on the bottom, and then I slowly, just by eye, cut a fairly straight kerf. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I guess the straighter the better. I'm not the greatest scroll sawer in the world, but I do good enough to make something like this, because sanding's always going to be required at the end anyhow. If you're really good, you might get away without sanding. I don't want to cut all the way through, but I want to cut down to what I feel is near the bottom of the ribbon. And I really want to try to follow this kerf that will keep the ribbon a semi-consistent width. So there's the completed kerf. I double-face taped a piece of scrap to the table of the scroll saw to help me follow that kerf that I just cut. I found that I kind of wander out of that kerf if I'm not careful, so I thought this might help. And this, in my third try, I found this to work very well, and I got a very consistent ribbon thickness. Now the trick. The scroll saw has a blade in it which is a spiral blade, which means the blade's been twisted so the teeth go all the way around the blade. This allows the scroll saw to cut not just in the forward direction but in a sideways direction at the same time. And that's what makes it so that you can push it forward and rotate at the same time. And so you'll see here that's what I'm doing. I'm pushing the sled and the finial forward as I rotate it to follow that spiral line. Again, scroll sawing's not my strength, but it seems to work out okay. And again, I'm pretty good with a sandpaper. I don't think this process would work very well if it wasn't for the dowel down the center, as I think that the ribbon, as it got thinner and thinner, would just break under the pressure of the scroll saw. The dowel gives it a little support so that it can survive the process. I saw this technique being used to make Christmas ornaments that were just spiral cut from a straight dowel. And somehow the two things clicked together, and I thought, this is how I can make a ribbon. It seems to work okay. Again, it's not the perfect process, but it gets you a ribbon that's within easy sanding of a final, rather than carving the whole thing, which is the way I think most people probably make these. I just go slow, try to get a good cut. Then when you get to the bottom, you have to remove the fence so that you can cut sideways, 90 degrees to the axis. And this is going to allow you to take out the scrap piece. Once you get through, you can take the piece off, and you can see sometimes the piece just falls out. Other times you have to twist it out, but it's fairly easy to get the scrap piece back out. And there is a finished ribbon finial. Now I leave the dowel in while I sand the edges, and you can see even in these pictures that there's some roughness to the edges. The dowel will give you a little bit of support until you can get everything smoothed out a little bit. When you're ready to remove the dowel, you want to go back and cut off the end or sand it off anyway, just to get the glue off. And once the glue's off, then the dowel should pretty much just slide right out. So now you have a finished ribbon finial, and you can put it onto a project. All you have to do at this point is sand, and then dye, paint, do whatever you want. I want to thank Roger Meeker for all of his help in filming this. Thank you, Roger. This turned out great. I hoped you liked my first real how-to video on turning. Maybe after I've done 100 of these like Captain Eddie, Alan, Carl, and Robbie, my film quality will get better, as well as my speech patterns and everything else. If you like this video, I would appreciate it. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below the video. Thank you very much. Have a great holiday season.